The morning she walked back into Ashmore Park, the frost had not yet lifted from the stone steps, and the footman who opened the door did not recognize her at first. He saw a woman in a plain gray traveling cloak, her bonnet unpinned and hanging at one elbow, worn from 2 days of road and the kind of weather that November produces in the English countryside, with cheerful indifference to human inconvenience. Her free arm curved around a small boy of perhaps 2 years, who watched the footman with the Duke's own dark eyes. The footman's mouth opened, then closed. His gaze moved between her face and the child's face and back again, performing the rapid arithmetic of recognition. Then he stood aside, because whatever else she was the Duchess of Ashmore, and the hall behind him was hers by law, if not yet by any living soul's acknowledgement. She did not wait to be announced. The hall at Ashmore Park was as she remembered it: high ceilings, cold marble, the portrait of the third Duke watching the entrance with the particular expression of a man who had survived much and expected to survive more. The flowers on the side table were dahlias, dried and arranged by someone with a careful eye. The footman had left the door ajar, and the cold came in behind her. She did not go back to close it. Margaret Caverley, the Duchess of Ashmore, had walked through that door as a bride 3 years before. She had not walked back out through it willingly. And whatever the Tun had decided in her absence, whatever the lawyers had drafted and the dowager had whispered, and the gossips had built into an edifice of comfortable scandal, she was here now, and the child against her shoulder was breathing the cold indoor air of a house that was half his by blood, and she intended to remain. She had rehearsed this moment across 2 days of road and 1 sleepless night at a posting inn where the wind found every gap in the window frame, and William had finally slept across her lap while she sat upright in the chair and thought about what she would say, and in what order. None of her rehearsed sentences felt adequate now. She set them aside. The boy's name was William. He was 2 years and 3 months old. He had his father's jaw and his mother's stubbornness, and he had never in his short life been inside a house this large, and he pressed his face quietly into his mother's neck and held on. His small hand found the collar of her cloak and gripped it. She heard the Duke before she saw him. His footstep on the upper landing was the same measured fall she had known from the first week of their marriage, the sound of a man who had learned that haste communicated weakness. She stood in the center of the hall and did not move. She had rehearsed this moment across 200 miles of road, and she had not decided yet what her face would do. She let it do nothing. She let him see her clearly. He stopped at the top of the stair. He was in riding dress, clearly returned moments ago from his morning ride, his coat still carrying the cold of the air outside. He was 32. He had not changed in the ways she had feared, had not grown soft or careless, or replaced by some stranger in a familiar frame. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has long since accepted he will never see again. Then he looked at the child. He said nothing. The silence in the hall was complete enough that she could hear one of the upstairs maids, somewhere down a corridor, stop moving. He came down the stairs slowly. He stopped 3 steps from the bottom, at eye level with her, and his gaze moved between her face and the boy's, and back again, and his expression did not change, but his hand found the banister and gripped it. "Margaret," he said at last, his voice entirely level. "Your Grace," she said. And the boy, because he was 2 years old and had no knowledge of the correct protocol for greeting a duke, turned his face from his mother's shoulder and looked at the man on the stairs with frank, uncomplicated curiosity. Nothing in the hall moved for a long moment. If you have ever wondered what it looks like when a man's entire settled understanding of his life is quietly dismantled by a single dark-eyed child, stay with this. Because what happened next at Ashmore Park was not what the Tun expected, and it was not what Margaret had feared. and it became the story that Winter would carry for years. The gossip reached London within a week. It always did. From that house? From any house in the county where the Duke of Ashmore was discussed, which was most of them. The story that arrived was not entirely accurate, but accuracy had never been the Tun's most prized quality. What people said was this: the Duchess, who had vanished 3 years ago under circumstances no one had ever satisfactorily explained, had returned to Ashmore Park with a child of roughly 2 years, that the Duke had neither turned her away at the door nor publicly welcomed her, and that the child's parentage was, to borrow the phrase Lady Macclesfield had used at 3 separate dinner tables, a matter the Duke himself could not explain. What the Tun meant by that phrase was carefully shaped to wound. Margaret knew the phrase was coming before she heard it. She had known it the moment she walked through the door. She had known it, if she was truthful with herself, from the moment she had first understood that she was carrying a child and that she was alone, and that the road back would be harder than the road that had brought her here. She had learned, in the years away, to know in advance what rooms would cost her. She had learned other things as well. She had learned to manage a small household on reduced means, to negotiate with tradesmen, and keep accounts in a small, neat hand that she had never been trained for, but that turned out to be the work of logic rather than of special education. She had learned that a woman alone is assumed to be in distress until she proves otherwise, and that the proof must be ongoing, must be demonstrated daily in the posture of someone who has not forgotten how to occupy a room with authority. She had learned that the distance between the life she had been raised to expect and the life she had actually been living was not, in the end, as disabling as she had feared in the first months. She had learned to read her son's face for hunger and cold, and the specific variety of uncertainty that comes over a child in an unfamiliar space, and to resolve each before it became a problem. She had learned that love, the actual daily practice of it, was less like the thing she had been raised to expect, and more like the work her hands had always known, repetitive, demanding, unglamorous, and irreplaceable. She had learned what she was made of, which was something she might otherwise never have known. She was 25 years old. Her husband thought she had left him. That was the wound she had returned to address, and it was the one she had no clean language for, because the truth required him to believe her, and she did not yet know if he would. She had no document. She had her uncle's letter, which she had kept, and the memory of leaving a note that he had apparently never received, and 3 years of evidence that a woman alone in England is not the automatic author of her own circumstances. None of that constituted proof. All of it constituted the truth. Let me tell you what had actually happened. 3 years before, in the 3rd month of her marriage to the Duke of Ashmore, Margaret had received a letter. It was from her mother's eldest brother, a man she had met perhaps 4 times in her life, a man whose name she knew as a child knows the names of distant furniture. The letter informed her that her mother, who had been ill for 2 years, and whom Margaret had been forbidden to visit because the Duke's estates and her mother's were 3 days' travel apart, and the season was pressing, had taken a very severe turn. The letter said her mother was asking for her. The letter said there was perhaps a week. She had gone to her husband with the letter in her hand. She had found him in conversation with his man of business, a conversation she could hear through the study door was not to be interrupted, and she had waited in the corridor for 20 minutes. And then she had gone back to her room and written him a note explaining where she was going and why. And she had taken the letter and the note and the carriage that her mother's brother had sent. And she had gone. The Duke had been from home when the note was found. His man of business had accepted it, had placed it on the study desk, and had neglected to mention to anyone that the Duchess had departed, because that was not his business to mention. The Duke had returned 2 days later from an unplanned visit to a neighboring property. By then, the carriage was 2 days gone. What the Duke had found on his desk was not her note. It was an estate document she had been reviewing, left open where she had been sitting before she heard the news. The note was beneath it, and had been slid there, possibly by a housemaid tidying, when the desk was cleared of the morning's papers. He had sent men after the carriage within the day. Her uncle's letter had given a direction in Kent that proved to be old by 3 years, and the men went where the letter said. And her mother had moved, and the trail was cold before it was warm, and by the time anyone found the small house in Wiltshire where her mother had actually settled, Margaret had been there for 6 weeks. Her mother had died, and she had been alone in a rented room for a fortnight with the knowledge that she was carrying a child. She had written to him. The letter had been addressed to Ashmore Park. It had been received, eventually, by the Dowager, who had moved into Ashmore Park in the first week of her daughter-in-law's absence, and had settled there with the comfortable authority of a woman who believes she is correcting a previous error. The Dowager had not forwarded the letter. She had, in her own way, answered it. The answer Margaret received said that the Duke had spoken with his solicitors. It said that the Duchess's absence would need to be addressed in formal terms. It said, with the precision of a woman whose sentences were always calibrated to wound while remaining technically polite, that a duchess who abandoned her husband's house in the 3rd month of her marriage had perhaps made her preferences clear enough that everyone might now proceed accordingly. Margaret had read that letter in a rented room in Wiltshire, with her mother 3 weeks in the ground, and her child making itself known in the particular way of early months. She had sat with it for a long time. She had not gone home. Not then. She had not had the courage for it, and she would not pretend otherwise. She had gone instead to her mother's cousin in Somerset, a widow of moderate means and large, unfrightened practicality, who had asked 2 questions, received honest answers to both, and opened her house without further comment. And there Margaret had remained, and there William had been born, and there she had spent 2 years learning what she had told you she learned. She had gone home when William was old enough to travel. She had gone home because the alternative was to let the Dowager's careful architecture stand, and she found that she could not. What she had not gone home expecting was hope. There it was, inconvenient, lodged in the fact that he had not turned her away at the door. The Duke did not speak to her for 3 days. He was not cruel about it. He was not cold in the theatrical manner of a man performing injury. He simply moved through Ashmore Park as he had always moved, with the contained authority of a man who had ordered his world into its proper compartments and did not open compartments before he was ready. She remembered this quality from the early weeks of their marriage. The way he managed his interior by managing his time, the structured days that left no loose edges. He rode in the morning at the same hour, returned at the same hour, handed his horse to the groom with the same brief exchange of words. He took his meals in his study. He received his steward and his man of business and 2 neighboring landowners who had heard nothing yet, and came to discuss a matter of disputed drainage between 2 local properties. He sat with his correspondents in the evenings. He did not come to the rooms she had been given in the East Wing, the rooms she had used as a bride, and he did not summon her. She did not press him. She had come 3 years and 200 miles. She could afford to wait 3 days for a man to think. She spent those days making herself useful. She spoke with the housekeeper, who received her with the careful neutrality of a woman who has learned not to express opinions about the domestic arrangements of the family she serves. She walked the winter kitchen garden in the afternoon with William, who was fascinated by the bare beds and the dormant shapes of things he could not name, and she named them for him in the cold air. The old roses and the lavender cut back and the broad earth waiting. She wrote letters. She slept, each night, more deeply than she had slept in years. The particular sleep of a body that recognizes it is in the right place. He did, however, stand in the hall on the second morning and watch William for approximately 4 minutes while Margaret sat on the lower stair with the boy and showed him how to stack a series of wooden blocks she had found in a box in the nursery. The blocks were old, painted in the style of 30 years past, with the paint worn at the corners, and the edges softened by the handling of generations of children who had played in this house. The Duke stood at the edge of the hall, with his riding gloves in his hand, and watched his son stack blocks, and William, who by then had decided the large, quiet man was interesting rather than alarming, held up a block and said, "Look," with the confident expectation of toddlers that the world is paying attention to them. The Duke looked. He said, "Well done," very quietly. William considered him for a moment, as though assessing the sincerity of this, and apparently found it sufficient. He put the block down and looked for another one. The Duke left. Margaret breathed. She had not known, until that moment, how much weight she had been carrying in her chest. It did not resolve anything. It was the first crack in the surface of something, and she knew the shape of cracks well enough by now to know what they preceded. It was on the third day that the Dowager arrived. She came in a carriage that announced itself half a mile down the drive, and she swept into the hall with the economical fury of a woman who has received information she was not sent. And she found Margaret in the morning room with a cup of tea and a letter she was composing to her solicitor. And she stopped inside the doorway and looked at the woman she had assumed she had successfully removed from this house, and she said, with the precision that was her signature, "I see the wanderer has come home." That was the first time. Margaret said, "Good morning, your ladyship," and set down her pen. The Dowager was 60 years old and had been managing the world around her since she was 16, and she did not permit the lack of response to slow her. She came into the room, and she did not sit down. And she said, "Whatever you have told him, whatever story you have constructed to account for your long absence and the child you have produced, I intend to make certain that people understand the truth." "The truth," Margaret said, "is exactly what I hope they will understand." The Dowager looked at her for a moment with the cool assessment of a woman recalibrating. Then she said, "There is a young woman in London, Miss Aldwych, suitable in every respect. Your absence was very long. There were discussions." Margaret picked up her pen. "I would like to know," she said, "whether my husband was a party to those discussions." The Dowager did not answer that. She left. In the corridor, Margaret heard her ask a footman where the Duke was to be found. She set down the pen again. She went to find him first. He was in the library. He was standing at the window that looked out over the west lawn, and he turned when she came in. And for a moment, neither of them said anything. The room was large. The distance between them was not. She said, "Your mother has arrived." "I am aware." She mentioned Miss Aldwych. Something moved across his face and was controlled. "She did not," he said at last, "speak to me about Miss Aldwych in any capacity that bound me." Margaret heard that. She took it apart the way she had learned to take apart careful statements in the last 3 years, looking for the weight of what was being said and what was being left out. He was telling her that the Dowager had worked around him. He was not yet telling her what he had wanted. She said, "There is something I need you to know. About why I left. About the letter your man of business received." He was very still. She reached into the inner pocket of her Spencer jacket and produced a letter. It was creased from years of careful keeping. The paper softened and the handwriting faded at the folds, but legible. She held it out. He looked at it for a moment, and then he took it, and he read it, and she watched his face while he did. She told him. She told him all of it, standing 6 feet away from him in the library while the fire burned down at their backs. The letter, the carriage, the note she had left on his desk, the 2-day delay before his return, the wrong address her uncle had given for her mother's establishment in Kent, the trail that had gone cold before his men reached Wiltshire, her mother's death, and the rented room and the weeks she had spent alone before. She understood what was coming. She told him about the Dowager's letter. She told him what it had said. She told him that she had read it in a room where the only fire was insufficient, and her mother was 3 weeks in the ground, and she had not known what to do with the sentence about the solicitors, had not known whether to interpret it as the actual voice of the Duke, or the voice of a woman who had learned to speak in his name. She told him she had chosen to believe it was the latter, eventually, because the alternative required her to believe something about him that her knowledge of him in the months of their marriage would not support. She did not ask him to be sorry. She did not give him the face of someone performing innocence. She gave him the facts in the order they had happened, the way she might have told them to a solicitor. And she held her hands quietly at her sides and looked at him. He did not speak for a long time after she had finished. When he did, his voice was low. He said, "You wrote to me. I wrote to you." She answered, in terms that made it clear to me that whatever path I had left was now closed. He turned back to the window. She could see the line of his jaw against the gray light, and she could see him working at something he was not yet ready to share, and she had 3 years of practice at recognizing when pushing would cost more than waiting. And she waited. He said, "I looked for you." The words landed without decoration. "I know," she said. "You sent men to Kent." "I sent men 3 times, he said, over the first year. Your uncle claimed not to know your direction. I sent to every member of your family I could locate. I received no reply from most of them, and evasion from the rest." A pause. "I did not know if you were well." The fire shifted. "I was well," she said. "I was more than well. I had your son in Somerset, under the care of my mother's cousin, and I was afraid to come home because I had been made to believe the door was closed, and I am sorry for that. I am sorry I was not braver sooner." He turned from the window. He looked at her the way he had looked at her from the staircase landing, the way a man looks at something he had settled into grief over, looking now to discover whether the grief was correct or premature. "He has my eyes," he said. "He has your eyes and your jaw and the way you go very still when you are thinking," she said. "He will be unbearable in about 20 years. He looked at her for one more moment. Then, just barely, the corner of his mouth moved. It was the first time she had seen that in 3 years, and it undid something in her that she had not known she was still holding together. He said, "Where is he now?" "With the nursery maid. She brought him down from Somerset with me. He is 2 years and 3 months old. His name is William James Ashmore, and I have been waiting to bring him home since the month he was born." He said very quietly, "William, after your father," she said. Her voice stopped. She began again. "I thought you would want that. I thought even if nothing else was recoverable, you would want that." He crossed the room in 3 strides, and he took her face in both his hands, and he looked at her for a moment that contained everything the last 3 years had cost them, and then he pressed his forehead to hers. Neither of them spoke. The fire crackled behind them. Outside, the frost on the lawn was finally beginning to melt. Thin channels of water running between the pale lines of it. The grass beneath, returning to its proper color. She put her hand over one of his. He did not let go. It was not resolved in that moment. She would tell you that herself, if you asked. There was still the dowager. There was still the question of the young woman, and whatever formal discussions had or had not occurred. There was still his man of business and the solicitor, and the particular machinery of correction that would need to engage before her position was procedurally secure. There was still the ton. There was still Lady Macclesfield, and the phrase she had coined. There was still the fact that 2 years of misunderstanding had been allowed to calcify into assumption, and that dismantling an assumption required witnesses. He had not let go of her face. That was the only fact that mattered to her in that moment, and she held it carefully, the way she held things she could not afford to drop. The dinner party at Ashmore Park happened 12 days later. It was not a large assembly, perhaps 22 persons, the local gentry, and 2 visiting members of the peerage who happened to be in the county, and whose presence guaranteed that whatever occurred would be accurately reported to London before the end of the week. The dowager had arranged it. That fact alone should have served as warning. But the Duke had agreed to the assembly, and Margaret had agreed to appear, because she was the Duchess of Ashmore. And appearing in her own dining room was not something she intended to shy away from. The dowager had arranged the seating. Margaret discovered this when she found the young woman placed at the Duke's right hand, and herself placed at the far end of the table, between a baronet she did not know and an empty chair. She sat down. She ate her soup. Across the table, one of the visiting gentlemen, a Sir Edward Fenton, leaned toward the woman beside him and said, in the particular carrying murmur of a man who believes he is being discreet, that it was very modern of Ashmore to manage his domestic arrangements so openly, and that the returned Duchess and her unexplained child were a more colorful addition to the county than anyone had expected. That was the second voicing. She heard it clearly. So did the woman beside Sir Edward, who had the grace to look uncomfortable. So did the baronet at Margaret's elbow, who examined his soup spoon with sudden intensity. At the head of the table, the young woman said something quiet to the Duke, and smiled with the practiced charm of a woman who had been told her entire life that she was the correct choice. She was 20 years old and beautiful, and entirely innocent of any role in the architecture that surrounded her. And Margaret felt nothing hostile toward her. She felt only tired. The Duke said something briefly in reply. His expression did not shift. His eyes moved, once, to the far end of the table, to Margaret's face. She held it. He looked at the young woman. He said calmly, and without raising his voice, something that the table could not quite hear. Her smile faltered. Whatever he had said, the woman beside her heard it, and it shifted her expression in a way that told Margaret the sentence had been clear and brief and decisive. He picked up his wine. He did not look at his mother. The dowager, who had been surveying the table with the satisfaction of a woman watching her arrangements perform as intended, became very still. The dinner continued. After it, in the drawing-room, when the women had withdrawn and the gentlemen were still with their port, the dowager came to stand beside Margaret at the window. She held her fan at precisely the measured height she always held it, and she looked at the garden below, and she said very quietly, "Whatever you have told him, a woman who abandons her husband's house does not simply return to it and resume. Margaret said, "I did not abandon it. The county has a different understanding." "The county," Margaret said, "has had 3 years to construct whatever understanding suited it best. I am not responsible for what it built in my absence." The dowager looked at her for a moment, with the expression of a woman recalibrating for the second time. Then she said, with the precision of someone delivering what they believe to be a final judgment, "He will come to see reason. He always does." That was the third voicing. Dressed in different fabric, but the shape of it was the same, a woman who was not quite real, who could be managed back out of the frame. The wanderer, the unexplained child, the problem to be resolved. Margaret turned from the window. She said, very quietly, "Your ladyship, I have a great deal of respect for what you built in this house in difficult years, and I have no wish to diminish it. I am going to ask you to consider whether the position you are defending is the one that will be most comfortable to inhabit in the years ahead." She left the dowager at the window. In the hall, the Duke was coming from the dining room, the other gentleman behind him. Conversation running easily the way it does when the port has been good, and the company has been equal to it. He saw her cross the hall. He said something brief to the man beside him, and separated from the group. He crossed to her. He took her arm, as he would take his wife's arm, correctly and properly, in front of witnesses. He said quietly, "Are you well?" "Quite well," she said. He looked at the drawing-room door. "My mother." "Yes." "She arranged the seating." "I noticed." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I spoke to the young woman at dinner. I told her, with as much courtesy as I could manage, that she had been placed at my table under a misunderstanding about my circumstances, and that the misunderstanding was entirely my mother's and not mine, and that I was sorry she had been put in an awkward position." Margaret looked up at him. He said, "I should have done it before the dinner. I should have done it 3 weeks ago. I was not certain of things 3 weeks ago, and now I am." "What are you certain of?" she asked, and her voice was very quiet. He looked at her for a moment with the full weight of a man who has spent 3 years in a house that was wrong in a way he could not name. Who has spent 3 years sleeping in a room that answered incorrectly every morning when he woke and listened for something that was not there. He said, "That my wife is home, that my son has a name I would have chosen, that whatever the county decides to make of this is something we will correct together, publicly, at the earliest opportunity." The gentleman behind him had moved to the drawing room. The hall was quiet. She said, "Your mother will not be easily corrected." "No," he agreed. "She will take some time. She corrects eventually. She is, beneath the architecture, a practical woman." "And the ton?" "The ton," he said, with a tone so dry it barely qualified as rye, "will require a public occasion." The occasion he chose was the county assembly, 3 weeks later. It was the largest regular gathering in that part of the county, held in the assembly rooms in the market town, attended by everyone of any standing within 20 miles. And it had the advantage of including every person who had heard Lady Macclesfield's formulation and every person who had passed it along. The invitations had been sent before Margaret's return. The assembly would have occurred regardless. What the Duke chose was simply to attend it, with his wife, as he had always attended it before her disappearance, as though 3 years had been a brief interruption in a pattern that had now resumed. He arrived with Margaret on his arm. He had arranged nothing dramatic. He had sent no one ahead. He had simply had his carriage ordered, and he had waited at the foot of the stairs while Margaret came down in a gown of deep blue that she had had made in the weeks since her return, a gown in the current fashion, cut properly and executed in a color that suited her. And he had looked at her the way he looked at things he was still learning not to be surprised by. He had held out his arm, She had taken it. He had the christening record in the inside pocket of his coat, registered at the parish church 4 days before in the correct name, William James Caverly Ashmore, in the Duke's own handwriting, witnessed by the vicar and 2 of the church wardens, properly sealed. He had not told Margaret about the christening record. He had simply had it done. The assembly hall went very quiet when they entered. Not silent. The orchestra continued. The candles in the chandeliers continued their warm and indifferent burning. People's mouths continued to move in conversations that had been perfectly fluid a moment before. The quality of the noise changed. The particular change that occurs when something enters a room that the room had not expected and must now recalibrate its understanding to accommodate. A subtle shift in the register of 100 simultaneous small exchanges as eyes moved and words were suppressed, and the intelligence that spreads through a crowded room by means no one can quite account for did its work. Lady Macclesfield was standing near the entrance with 2 of her particular friends. She looked at Margaret, and then at the Duke, and then back at Margaret. And she said, in a carrying voice pitched at the specific register of a woman who wishes to be overheard by approximately the right number of people. So the wanderer returns, with her unexplained addition, and we are all simply to proceed, as though nothing has occurred. The Duke stopped. He had taken perhaps 4 steps into the room. He stopped, and he turned, and he looked at Lady Macclesfield with the particular quality of attention that a duke of his standing can deploy without effort, the kind that reorganizes a room around the direction of its gaze, unhurried and complete. Lady Macclesfield met it with the confidence of a woman who has held social ground for 30 years and considers herself quite capable of holding it against a single duke. He said, "Lady Macclesfield." The room was paying attention now. The conversations nearest to them had not exactly stopped, but they had become very thin, the words hollowed out by the attention underneath them. He said, "The child's name is William James Caverly Ashmore. He was born in Somerset to my wife, the Duchess of Ashmore, in the 2nd year of her absence, which was the result of a family bereavement and a consequent failure of correspondence, the particulars of which I am happy to provide to anyone who requires them. There is nothing to explain. He is my son, and she is my wife, and I am glad to have them both home." The sentence was 11 words. The last of them fell into a silence that the room held for a long beat, the kind of silence that follows something said which cannot be unsaid, which reorganizes what came before it. The orchestra played on. Somewhere at the edge of the room, a woman said something quietly to the man beside her, and he nodded. Another woman, nearby, turned to speak to her companion, and her companion's expression shifted into something that resolved, slowly, into a nod of the kind that means yes. That is the correct understanding. Lady Macclesfield closed her fan. The Duke turned back to Margaret. He said quietly, "Shall we?" She took his arm. They walked into the assembly. The room moved around them, not dramatically, not with the cinematic surging tide of something in a story, but with the small incremental adjustments of people who have understood that the available verdicts have shifted and are now orienting themselves to the new one. A neighbor crossed the floor to greet them. 2 ladies inclined their heads. The baronet from the dinner party caught Margaret's eye and made a small, precise bow that said, without words, that he was relieved to have occasion to do so. Across the room, the Duke's mother stood with her fan held at its measured height, and she looked at her son and her daughter-in-law, and she looked at the room accommodating them, and she was very still for a long moment. Then she closed her fan. Then she walked across the room, slowly, with her full authority. And she stopped beside Margaret and said, in a voice the immediate circle could hear, "I believe, my dear, that you have not met Mrs. Hallett. She was a great friend of your mother's in the early years. I have been meaning to introduce you." Margaret looked at her. The dowager did not quite meet her eyes. She was looking at the room, at the arrangement of it, with the expression of a woman who has located the most defensible position and moved to it with the efficiency that 3 decades of social management produces. "I would like that very much," Margaret said. The dowager inclined her head. They were not reconciled in that moment. Margaret was not naive enough to believe that one assembly and one retreat from a position constituted the whole of what lay ahead. There would be other occasions. There would be careful negotiations of authority and territory that would take years to work through. The dowager was not transformed. She was accommodating a reality she could not displace. She had moved. And that was, in its way, the thing. The winter that followed was the first winter Margaret had spent at Ashmore Park as something other than a bride navigating an unfamiliar house. She knew the house now, its cold corridors and its warm rooms, the window in the east wing that let in a draft the head footman had been trying to correct for a decade, the kitchen garden that was 3 times the size it needed to be for the household and supplied the village every autumn as a consequence, the library that smelled of old leather and wood smoke, and the particular quality of accumulated quiet that a room acquires when someone has done serious thinking in it over many years. She knew the Duke now too, in the way you know a person when you have had cause to decide to trust them, and they have given you reason to find that decision was not misplaced. He was not easy. He had 3 years of a wrong habit of thought to unwind, the habit of not expecting her to be there, and sometimes she would find him looking at her across a room with the look of a man who has not quite believed a thing yet, even though the evidence is in front of him. She let him look. She was patient with it in the way she was patient with William's occasional waking in the night, with the understanding that healing has its own pace and cannot be forced into a faster one without damage. William discovered the library in January. He had to be retrieved from it 3 times on 3 consecutive mornings before it was accepted that he would go there regardless of what other arrangements were made for his occupation. And the Duke, who found him there on the 3rd morning, sat down on the floor with him without any evident self-consciousness and read him the text of a pamphlet about drainage systems in a voice that held the same measured quality it held for everything, and William leaned against his arm and listened with every appearance of interest. Margaret stood in the doorway and watched them. She did not say anything. She did not need to. There is a miniature on the mantelpiece in the morning room at Ashmore Park. It is a small thing, the size of a palm, painted in the manner of the period with particular attention to the sitter's eyes. It is a portrait of a woman Margaret had not known before she married, the first Duchess, the Duke's mother in her youth, placed there by the dowager in the years before Margaret arrived and never moved. Margaret had left it where it was. She had walked past it for the first weeks of her marriage, and the dowager had watched her pass it and had never commented. And now she walked past it still. And what she saw when she looked at it was not a warning or a precedent, but simply a woman who had sat in the same rooms and looked out the same windows. She thought she understood, a little, what that woman might have felt. On the first morning of February, the frost returned to the stone steps. William was asleep. The house was very quiet. She was sitting at the writing desk in the morning room, at work on a letter to her mother's cousin in Somerset, when the Duke came in from his early ride still in his greatcoat, and he crossed the room without stopping, and he pressed a kiss to the top of her head, and he said nothing, and continued to the door on the far side that led to his study. She put down her pen. "Marcus," she said. He stopped. She said, "I am glad I came home." He stood in the doorway for a moment, his back to her, and she could see the set of his shoulders and the stillness that came over him when he was feeling something he had not yet worked out how to say. He said, "So am I." He went through the door. She picked up her pen. Outside the window, the frost on the lawn caught the morning light, and it was very bright, and it would not last the day. And that was exactly right.